Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you, Ralph. Good to be here.
Let's start by looking at Taiwan's overall economic performance in 2023. The economy contracted by 3.02%, and the estimated annual growth rate for this year is projected to be below 2%. During the first quarter, Taiwan's exports to China, including Hong Kong, saw a whopping decline of 30.7%. This was larger than the country's overall export growth rate of minus 19.1%. Peter, what can we read from these numbers?
Well, I think there are two key elements here. First of all, we saw a front loading of a lot of demand for electronic equipment, particularly consumer electronic equipment, during the COVID years. And so what we're seeing right now is the aftermath of that. And yet at the same time, a fairly substantial buildup of inventories for a lot of these components in anticipation of the continuation of that demand. So this is, first of all, that sort of absorption of that inventory in a still weak demand environment. Secondly, of course, in the longer term, we are beginning to see Taiwan, as is the rest of the world, beginning to decouple from China. But I don't think that would have had any impact on these numbers at this point, but it will probably be a drag going forward over the coming years.
Do you feel much of this has any to do with the U.S.-China ongoing tensions, as we've seen with the CHIPS Act, and we've seen more in terms of tariffs and all that?
Absolutely. And many Taiwanese companies that we speak with are reflecting to us the request from their customers, which are, of course, international corporations, to diversify their production base away from China and away from Taiwan as well. So there's a big push to be building new facilities in Southeast Asia, India, the Western countries as well. And this is going to have an impact on Taiwan's own exports in the long run. From the standpoint of the Taiwan companies themselves, they're still in control of that flow of products. They're going to become more maybe sort of logistic managers of this more disparate manufacturing base around the world. But from the standpoint of Taiwan exports per se, and even to some extent Taiwan jobs, Taiwan tax revenues, there could be a longer-term impact.
In terms of Taiwan's exports in the long run, as you mentioned, do you feel that this will actually be beneficial to Taiwan? We see impact in the short run, but what do you see in terms of long-term growth and the outlook?
Well, personally, I find it to be a positive trend. And we've seen actually Japan go through a similar pattern whereby, because of both political pressure from other countries to reduce their trade surplus, but also because of their own domestic demographic trends, that they've been forced to, again, diversify their own production base outside of Japan. And so they actually now have in place the policies to produce where you're selling as much as possible. And it's allowed them to maintain their market share, to maintain a more flexible production and distribution channel, and avoid some of the transportation bottlenecks that we are facing even today. And I think Taiwan's going to be going down that same path as well. That will also help develop a more of a domestic demand market here, which will allow other new industries to emerge, and I think also to improve the standard of living in the country as well.
For our international audience, can you talk a bit about where Taiwan's exports are? And you talked about with Japan to produce where they're actually selling. What about Taiwan? What markets are there in terms of outside of China?
Well, in terms of products, obviously we're talking primarily about electronics. I believe semiconductors still account for more than 40% of our exports. And those semiconductors, of course, are also going into the supply chain for making, obviously, mostly consumer electronics goods that, again, are mostly controlled by Taiwan companies as well. Although most of those factories, again, are in either China or now elsewhere. The export markets themselves around the world, again, obviously, the U.S. is by far the largest single market, but...
So that would be producing in the U.S., as we've seen with TSMC in Arizona.
Well, exactly. I mean, there is now that move among the larger companies primarily to go actually onshore in the U.S. As you mentioned, TSMC, obviously, Foxconn has a facility there still in progress. And other companies, I'm sure, will have to follow along with them to be their sort of ecosystem and supply chain too. But they're also looking at Mexico, not to mention, of course, as I said, the other markets elsewhere in the region, Southeast Asia, India, are also big areas of focus.
We've seen Foxconn expanding in Thailand and India.
India as well, exactly.
And as a global financial expert, which industries do you feel Taiwan has potential in?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I've always said that Taiwan's been suffering to some extent from the Dutch disease scenario where...
What about for first quarter 2023?
Okay. Well, look, the industries that are performing relatively well now, among them are still the healthcare sector, not outside of course, electronics altogether. The electronics sector is going to continue to suffer from the inventory overhang and slack demand that we talked about. But there are also smaller industries that are emerging too, not well represented in the listed share market though. And so again, what we're seeing is where some of these older industries have matured, again, the electronics industry in particular, or are moving offshore, it's allowing some of these other industries to emerge. But again, anything with scale and among the listed share market, I would say healthcare really still stands out among them.
We talked a bit about TSMC. I wanted to bring you back to TSMC in terms of Warren Buffett. We saw him dump shares of TSMC. What do you think's behind that?
Well, he himself says it's the geopolitical risks, which I find somewhat intriguing because these geopolitical risks existed well before he made his initial investment as well. And moreover, I think the geopolitical risks are to some extent diminishing at this point, certainly again compared to when he originally made his investment. I've pointed out many times that during these periods of rising cross-strait tensions, Taiwan has in the past proven to be a very good market to invest in because it creates a somewhat depressed valuation environment that usually pretty quickly resolves into a rebound in share prices. And indeed, we are seeing that taking place at this very point.
A good market to invest in, indeed. Do you feel other global investors share that view with Warren Buffett in terms of the geopolitical risk?
Absolutely. And I don't blame them. I mean, you read the newspapers, or if you are a manager of a large investment fund and you were to take a large position in Taiwan, it would be somewhat even irresponsible. Now, I don't feel the risks are as high as what the international media is making it out to be. Or what many of these investors themselves have expressed. But for them to first take a more conservative stance is only natural. But again, I do expect that with the passage of time, that issue will be resolved. We obviously have to get through the presidential elections here in Taiwan in January and see what happens then and what the aftermath to that is as well. So we're not totally out of the woods as yet, but I am still relatively optimistic.
The Taiwan and the U.S. are aiming to sign a bilateral trade agreement. It could open up markets between two countries and take away tariffs and also address other issues that are non-related. What do you think a U.S.-Taiwan BTA could do in terms of helping Taiwan's economy?
Well, I think as far as reducing tariffs, it's not going to be addressing that issue in the short term. I think it's more about rationalizing and integrating the Taiwan supply chains with the U.S. market itself.
So it's a part of a larger decoupling trend?
I would say that will be an outgrowth of it for sure. And it does, of course, allow for future tariff reductions at some point. But I think more importantly, it also provides cover for other countries to now begin discussions with Taiwan. I think many of them were waiting for this U.S.-Taiwan BTA to be signed before they stick their neck out and begin the same process. So I think we will beginning to see Taiwan get reintegrated into the global trade environments at a time when the WTO itself has been somewhat emasculated, and so many other countries were establishing bilateral or multilateral free trade agreements that excluded Taiwan. So Taiwan's advantage of having been in WTO has actually been diminishing over the years, and I think now we can begin reversing that process.
Not just bilateral, but if we talk about multilateral, do you feel that if this is successfully passed and signed, will this increase Taiwan's chances in the CPTPP?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, it will, and I think the U.S. has been very aggressive in trying to, they need to get membership themselves first, but also to support Taiwan's membership application too. And I think, again, having this agreement, you're quite right, Ralph, will help facilitate that process. Again, it just takes a bit of that political risk out of the way for the organization to take that step.
Liz Truss was in Taiwan earlier. She talked about the need for the UK to support Taiwan's membership. Do you feel with the UK, or if it does come on board, will that help Taiwan's membership case?
Yeah, for sure. Look, the UK is, of course, now its own sort of trade bloc, and certainly a very influential player even in the European environment too. So I suspect that that will be helpful, having both the US and the UK. Now, the two are often sort of combined together, and so it's not a sign of greater diversity of support, but certainly it does add to that.
Yeah, do you feel that pressure from China could actually hamper some of the other member countries to encourage Taiwan to join?
Well, of course, China will be attempting to put pressure on other countries to do so, but the momentum right now is to stand up against that pressure among many of these countries.
So you do feel there's hope?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm actually fairly confident it will happen eventually, and maybe within the next few years.
I wanted to move a bit into inflation. Global inflation has led to an egg shortage here in Taiwan, and we've seen a slight price hike in various different things. With the ongoing war in Ukraine and an increasing action from China, what do you feel that will have in terms of impacting the local economy in Taiwan?
Well, look, inflation ultimately is, again, an outgrowth, of two factors. One, of course, there has been a massive amount of liquidity injected into the economy and into financial markets in response to the COVID epidemic, and we are still in the process of reabsorbing that liquidity, and that's created this upward pressure on prices. But COVID also had a fairly substantive impact on labor markets, reducing them in absolute size, a lot of early retirement, a lot of people just wishing to avoid health risks, and those who are working from home, which limits their ability to integrate back into the broader labor markets. But the biggest impact, I think, is really on the service sector. So we're actually seeing, I think we'll continue to see, a fall in goods market prices. We're seeing that certainly in the U.S. Numbers. Automobile prices are coming down very sharply, and yet services will remain stubbornly high. And so this will be, I think, something we'll see similarly take place here in Taiwan. But Taiwan's inflation rate nonetheless is considerably lower than many other countries in the world, in part because we have a high savings rate, and we have very low debt levels in this country, and that's something that will put us in good stead going forward.
In terms of bringing back the service sector, do you feel there's anything the government or companies need to do?
Well, yes, absolutely. Provide daycare service for mothers so that more women can come back into the workforce, providing maybe telemedicine services, which is another major source of service sector wage inflation. And I think also encouraging new automation at the factory level or at data-based services that could replace worker demands elsewhere as well.
And you talked about how inflation here is much lower than many other parts in the world. But do you feel there's anything that the government can do to mitigate that?
Well, I mean, there are those who claim that maybe inflation numbers are actually higher than what the government's reporting. I don't necessarily see that myself, but I'm not, out there buying in the markets every day. But look, I mean, as I said, I think the government has already a fairly good environment here for keeping inflation under wraps. And again, just facilitating a more flexible, more mobile labor market will go far in keeping inflation low going forward.